everybody. Welcome to another episode of Friends Talking Nerdy. This is Tim Jousma, and with me I have the greatest legal mind in the Pacific Northwest. It is Professor Aubrey.
Hello, everybody.
And we wanted to let you know that, again, if this is the first time you're listening to the show, remember to subscribe. That's really going to help us out. Follow us on social media and Discord to keep up with us throughout the week. Links are in the show description. We are here at episode 201.
201, woo!
Yes, and what we wanted to do to start off our next batch of 100 episodes is kind of have a sequel episode. We were a few episodes back. We had the privilege of interviewing Sheriff Ray Cyphers. That was episode 167, who is a sheriff in Texas, about his job, his career, and all that stuff. And I've made it no secret that I lean quite progressive, but I also do feel that if you do have a platform and you have the ability to encourage conversation about topics, especially topics as complicated as this, you go ahead and do it. Now, one critique though I did have of that is that we only heard his side of the story. For an issue like this, I think it is important to acknowledge that it is a much bigger issue and that there is a lot more involved than just the law enforcement side of things. So with that, we have a guest.
We do. We have a very special guest.
Yes, this person is an attorney in private practice who provides criminal defense, appellate advocacy, and other counsel to clients in Oregon. He's long been involved in politics and policy, and in addition to his law degree, holds 2 degrees in U.S. history, and, if I do say so myself, has impeccable taste in the ladies. How you doing, Bear Wilner-Nugent?
I'm doing great, and thank you for that fulsome introduction. And
Yes.
I wanted to say also thank you to both of you for having me on, but also to Sheriff Cyphers. I listened to the whole episode and the interview with him, and I thought he was very articulate and very full of enthusiasm for the issues that matter most to him.
Very much so, yeah. And, for our conversation here, obviously he's in Texas. We're all in Portland. So this is not going to be like a direct comment on anything that happens with him there. This is just a general conversation. But first things first. Anybody new on our show gets asked this question, and I've heard you've had some time to prepare for it. What is your nerd origin story?
I was raised by a pack of lawyers. I am by whatever measure, the 10th, 11th, 12th lawyer in my large extended family. And I'm a law nerd because it was my safety strategy when my career in academia fell short. I got into a great PhD program in U.S. history, which I had been studying in college and in my master's program. I turned it down at the last second. It was kind of a heartbreak for all involved. The department lost the money that would have come with me too. I lost what would have been the perfect history advisor for what I was going to do my PhD on. But what it was not only many factors that personally kept me in the Pacific Northwest and away from Chicago, where I would have had to go on for graduate school, but even more importantly, the throbbing nerd heartbeat of the law, and specifically appellate law, calling me back. So my late stepfather kind of helped establish appellate law as a particular specialty in California. There hadn't been people who did full-time appellate work, just that, in California before the early post-World War II years when he started his practice there. And then my mother is a preeminent appellate lawyer. They were married. They had a law practice together for many years. And my father is a lawyer as well, although he doesn't do appeals. He didn't do appeals. He's retired now from the practice of law. He did municipal law. But, scratch the surface in my family, and it's a 1 out of 2 chance that anyone will be a lawyer.
Nice. Do you have a follow-up?
Well, so was there anything besides the law that you felt like equally passionate about?
Yeah, so I also have an avocation in festival and event management and operations, and I've worked and volunteered at music festivals, fairs, gatherings, the Oregon Country Fair, Burning Man, Soak, you name it. Since 1992, I've worked on festivals every year. Even during COVID, I've been able to work on the Portland Winter Light Festival because it's outdoors and distanced. And I care a whole lot about helping people get good information, communicate effectively, and be safe when in large gatherings. And I've done a lot of training and received a huge amount of instruction on how to do that. And it's a lot of fun.
Nice. Okay, let's start off with this question here. What should be the goals and methods of the justice system, and how does it hold up to current practice?
Okay, that's like a whole career to answer that question. The goals and methods, let's start with the goals. The goal should be to promote safety, that is the lack of injury and harm to everyone on an enduring multi-generational basis. So not assisting people be captured in cycles of generational trauma, for example. I think, and speaking of which, one part of what I do that may be different from what the sheriff did, for example, is I try to question the basic givens, the foundational assumptions of the system we find ourselves in. I've been persuaded by commentators whose work I admire to refer, therefore, to the criminal legal system rather than the criminal justice system. Some people are more pejorative and call it the criminal punishment system. I think many people would have a harder time swallowing that, but could get their minds around the criminal legal system, because describing it as a legal system is informational. Describing it as a justice system is somewhat self-congratulatory at the end of the day. The methods, though, yeah, sorry, like the method, chapter 2, the methods. What are you going to say, Aubrey?
No. Go ahead with chapter 2, the methods.
The methods are not to probably invent something strange and new that no one's heard of before and no one's going to invest in buying into. I'm interested in methods that will work in the world we find ourselves in now. And the methods are manifold. The methods are to support organizers in their local communities organizing for the most necessary changes in the criminal legal system, which may be the election of reformed DAs or sheriffs in some places. It may be abolitionist movements in other places, starting with the abolition of money bail, for example. It may be arraignment court watching like they do on the internet in Maryland to make sure that people who are making their first appearance before a judge when bail is being set and other important matters are being considered, making sure that's being done in the light of day. But the point is, there's a need for manifold tactics, and to learn from people who are doing this work already and not to try to invent some new wheel, because the rights of criminally involved people are bleeding from so many cuts that any work helps. Any good work helps. And it doesn't need to be overly theoretical, which is the end of the chapter.
Okay.
Gotcha. So thinking about that, then, that there are manifold methods and we should be employing all of them at the same time. Do you think that decisions about how do we determine what the most important issue to tackle would be in a particular place? So money bail, obviously a huge issue.
I don't know that I can give you a method that will work reliably at finding the most important issue. What I'm saying is identify issues where there is already local organizing going on in the area where you can do your work. That's true for anyone. Like, learn from the people who are already there. Don't make assumptions that no one has addressed an issue. I think it's very important that people not parachute into communities that are already doing justice work.
Okay.
Good point.
All right. Next question here. What do you think is speaking of issues, what do you think is the most important issue to address first in regards to criminal justice reform, in Portland, Oregon? Obviously, that's going to be your area you can speak most on.
Well, throughout Oregon, addressing mandatory minimum sentencing is an issue that's overdue. Oregon's tried many times to deal with the legacy of ballot measure 11, which was passed in 1994. And a whole generation has grown up in its shadow. And getting the supposedly progressive, supposedly reformed DA Mike Schmidt to, for example, address Measure 11 charging is a Portland issue. And the DA's office calls the shots when mandatory minimum sentences are in play. And they get to decide, which is something, by the way, the point that the sheriff made as well. And he was talking about overcharging and charge stacking. And the DA can choose to charge offenses as non-Measure 11 and not trigger mandatory minimums in the first place if he thinks that law is as unjust as he publicly has said he does. From there, we work to the more persuadable suburban counties, or counties like Bend that are undergoing, Deschutes County, where Bend, Oregon is, that are undergoing political transformation as waves of people move there who may be open to different points of view. And we go on throughout the state. That's how you work these issues. You start with the thin end of, the thin end of the tool.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a follow-up question? You did not. Okay, we'll go on to the next one here.
Well,
oh, go ahead.
I mean,
You're contemplating.
I am contemplating.
You start with one DA, and then you say, look, we have someone who is in your position, who sits in your shoes in another county, and they've bought into this argument because they're persuaded by the overwhelming evidence that these laws don't make anyone any safer, and they instead dramatically misshape, the prison population of Oregon.
And
they
do you think
ruin a lot of productive years of people's lives?
Right. Do you think that Mike Schmidt, the DA in Portland or Multnomah County, is doing what he sort of promised voters he would do in that way?
Well, he's doing what some of the things he promised voters he would do. I think he's working with an office of career deputy district attorneys, some of them short timers, and they haven't all bought into his agenda 100%. There's been some important turnover in that office. There's been things that I am encouraged to see. This may be a little too inside baseball for your listeners because this is just one county out of thousands in the U.S. where we happen to live, but it's kind of diagnostic of, early term reform DAs. The jury is still out. And we have examples from Philadelphia and from San Francisco and Houston and other places around the country where there are other examples to look at.
Okay. During the unrest, we've heard a lot about, we've heard the slogan, defund the police a lot, as well as talk about prison abolition. Explain to us your thoughts on both of those topics.
I think it's essential to have bold, clear stances in any organizing movement because you don't want to bargain against yourself. You don't want to water down your ultimate beliefs when you're starting out. You may have to make many compromises in the course of political organizing over time, and you may have to make many agreements that prove distasteful and that lead you to question the values, but you have to start with clear values. And saying that the justice system, the legal system is radically broken, needs rethinking from the ground up, needs to learn from the examples of other countries that do it better and not be so arrogant, saying that the legal system needs dramatic change should be expressed in bold, clear terms. There's no need to pre-compromise on everything in politics. And I think it's great to start with plain slogans and then work from there. Slogans aren't the law. And saying that, making the debate about the slogans ultimately distracts from the debate about the law. And I think people should be clear about that as well. It's talking about the same words again and again and again will not advance anyone's material interests.
We were interested more in actually what that issue is about, though, and just using those words as a shorthand to say, what do you think about alternatives to policing for public safety, which is sort of the defund the police slogan, what that really means, right?
I think it means having a variety of subspecialties in public service who do work to support the public who are having urgent needs, whether those are urgent mental health care workers, urgent medical care workers, urgent physical emergency workers who are working on dealing with people who are injured or who need rescue, whether it's people who are trained in de-escalation tactics, neighborhood mediators, traffic enforcement officers who genuinely just enforce traffic law and don't use it as a pretext for drug investigations or other racially biased police investigations. If you break down all those subspecialties, you carve them off the basic police mission, and then you're left with a very small criminal investigative unit that, coupled with no more police work on violent and victimless crimes, leads you to have a police work that's mostly focused on certain violent and sexual offenses. And then I think you have an appropriately sized police force.
Are you encouraged by the ballot measure in Minneapolis that was recorded by Vice News? I guess they have it on, they have a ballot measure that's coming up in November that would essentially do away with the police department and switch it into a department called the Department of Public Safety, which would do what you said. The sole focus would not be policing as it is today, but hiring other folks as well to kind of supplement that may be better suited to take care of that. Are you encouraged by that? Do you think that, do you see enough signs that maybe this could happen in Portland or around the country?
Yes, I'm encouraged. It's part of the multiplicity of tactics that I think is important. Yes, I think it could happen in Portland and around the country. I'll give you a short answer this time just to be perverse.
So perverse of you. Well, thinking about prison abolition as well, or the idea that prison and prisoners' experiences need to be broken down and rebuilt and significantly reformed. Do you think that I kind of have two questions. So one question is about corrections and particular issues that our listeners might not be aware of that prisoners might face, whatever their crime. And then my other question is more about avoiding corrections to begin with by making fewer things illegal. Or
sure. I'd have to discuss both topics. That's plenty. So you may have to remind me about the second one.
Okay, I will.
Road with the first one. Okay, so topics that matter to prisoners. Let me first say that, as your listeners may or may not know, that I work a lot of appellate, post-conviction, and habeas corpus cases, which puts me in touch directly with people in prison, because these are people who've already been convicted and are working on some challenge or another to their conviction or their sentence or both. So that's the background that I have on this. And as the course of this, I visit a lot of prisons around the state as well as jails. Mostly prisons, because most of my clients have been convicted of felonies and sentenced to prisons. And so most of the clients we're talking about here. Anyway, one thing that really matters to people in prison is an unfortunate topic that I think really goes under-discussed in the press: the way that prison officials permit prisoners to exert power over other prisoners in illicit ways. It's something that's on the books everywhere as an offense, and prisoners can be given prison discipline for bullying other inmates, but those disciplinary offenses are meted out themselves in an unfair way and in a way that reinforces power relations within the prison. And so as a result, it's very common for prisoners for prison officials, including in Oregon, to turn a blind eye to prisoners running the prisons in a certain way through violence, which shouldn't be happening and doesn't improve anyone's life or make them a better human once they come out of prison. And everyone there who's not serving a life sentence, everyone there who hasn't been convicted of murder is going to come out. And so many people convicted of murder as well. And so prisoners will demand to see other prisoners' legal paperwork, and they'll enforce that through the threat of violence. And then they'll inflict violence or sexual injury or other kinds of injury on prisoners who are convicted of sexual offenses. They'll force them to do favors for them. They will inflict injury on other prisoners who have been found to have been cooperating or even just suspected to have been cooperating with law enforcement, even though not necessarily a preponderance, but a very large number of prisoners have cooperated at some point. And otherwise, they'll use information gathered from each other to terrorize each other. And those informal hierarchies of violence in prisons are nothing new, but there's no reason that a supposedly progressive state has to tolerate them. And I found governor after governor of the state, supposedly progressive governors, unwilling to really clean house at the Oregon Department of Corrections. And this is a problem that I suspect is worse in other states that may not give the attention to the human rights of prisoners that Oregon ostensibly does in a couple of ways. And a classic example of Oregon being Oregon is the new push this year to call prisoners or inmates adults in custody instead. Adults in custody or juveniles in custody. and that supposedly it's more humane language. And that's just a classic example of rearranging the deck chairs on a sinking ship. But the prison system, has been terrible in its handling of COVID, and that comes on top of this phenomenon, this underlying long-running phenomenon that I'm describing of prisoner on prisoner violence connected with information about the histories of each person. And that's not to mention prison gang violence and the racist gangs we have in Oregon prisons. And there's a great danger from white supremacist gangs in Oregon prisons. So some people have taken a tactic of joining a known neutral group, like saying that they're Buddhist and becoming Buddhist for their stay in prison, because the Buddhist group is a known neutral off-limits group, just as one example.
Interesting.
Nice.
And then the second part was about offenses that you see charged that you think shouldn't be charged like on a regular basis. Like what are there offenses that you think shouldn't be offenses?
Number one, sex work offenses. And, I have seen prosecutors, for example, in Clackamas County, which is next door to Multnomah County here, charging somebody with prostitution for a sexual act that even in the allegation was never completed. The officer supposedly stopped the person on the way to the act of prostitution, but because they'd supposedly made an illegal agreement for sex for money, just the illegal agreement was supposedly enough. Alone was supposedly enough. So this allegation was made about an incident that supposedly happened in early 2019. The district attorney's office in our neighboring county charged this in early 2020 during the pandemic, after the pandemic had begun. They thought it was a great use of public money to charge this person. They pursued this person through the courts for a year, and ultimately the charges against the person were dismissed because the district attorney's office decided they couldn't prove the case. And, I was very happy to obtain that result for the person. And we'll be able to get the person's criminal record of arrest entirely set aside due to Oregon law, which is very good. So I'm preserving the person's anonymity, but from public records, you can reconstruct this story that I've already shared. It's nothing secret, it's no client secret, or I wouldn't be saying it on the podcast. It's a public story. And that's an example of a county abusing public money and an elected district attorney who's not a reformed district attorney doing it the old line way. But even in Multnomah County, Mike Schmidt maintains a hardcore sex work enforcer who's a zealot, who's got a mission, and who works with a group of cops who are very much true believers in the Portland Police Bureau and who run a lot of undercover missions. And they spend huge amounts of public money. When the cops are, people are complaining and crying every day there's not cops on the street, when their car and their catalytic converter gets stolen, or all the things that happen to people in Portland. But these cops are out here wasting public money prosecuting sex workers, and it's a huge scandal, and it's going on all over this state. And that is the number one thing. We could save a lot of actual public safety dollars if we completely decriminalized sex work. And then, obviously, Oregon voters had to speak up because law enforcement and prosecutors were not getting the message. Oregon voters spoke up and decriminalized drugs. So that's a huge advantage, and it's changed and revolutionized our practice. But the next thing that's happening, and this is going to follow it whenever they can, in Southern Oregon, you're seeing a massive wave of marijuana prosecutions again, because people who are running unsanctioned enterprises that aren't permitted by the OLCC, the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, I should say, for people outside Oregon, or the agencies that oversee medical or industrial cannabis, people who are growing cannabis without permission are now being prosecuted in large numbers again in Southern Oregon, and they're being very aggressive down there because they have this vast machine for arrests and prosecutions that only knows one thing to do. Again, we need to invest in other public safety specialties.
One question I wanted to bring up is the police when it comes to homeless people, which kind of ties into this question. Now, certain homeless, I've spoken with certain homeless advocates in Portland here and heard stories about how the police will arrest like a homeless person for going to the bathroom outside, but then it charge them in a way to where they end up on like a sex registry list or something like that, pretty much guaranteeing that they're not going to be able to get out of the hole they're in. I mean, have you, as a lawyer, have you seen that occurring? And what steps would you like to see taken for responsible enforcement of the law?
Well, first of all, I would say that the mix of cases I see now is different from what I used to see. When I was a line public defender starting out my career as a baby lawyer at at Metropolitan Public Defender here in Portland, I would see those kinds of cases. Now I don't see them very often, except for the occasional public defense appeal that I do for the state of Oregon. But for reasons that are boring and technical, that wouldn't be a kind of case I would typically get an appeal. But I do a mixture of public defense for the federal and state governments and private work. But I don't do day-to-day street public defense in Oregon, in Multnomah County, like I did for the first 3.5 years of my career. Mm-hmm. And so I can't comment on practices the same way that I could regarding past practices. I would say that in the past, that is not a pattern you would typically see just to jam someone up on a sex offense for having urinated in public. But it's certainly true that you could use the law that way. It's not impossible, and I certainly couldn't rule out that that's ever been done. That's an example that's narrow enough that I probably don't want to spend a lot of time analyzing it compared to other examples.
Got it. Copy that. Okay, then we'll go on to another question here. Speaking of use involved in corrections, the ACLU states that most states continue to use the training school method of corrections for kids, which keeps them from their friends and families. What struggles do you see in regards to kids in the justice system, and what changes would you like to see?
Well, so I made a choice early in my career to not get into juvenile or family law issues. Not to say that I'm a completely uninformed commentator. I work with Measure 11 involved juveniles because they're being charged as adults. But other than those 15, 16, and 17-year-olds who can be charged as adults under Oregon's mandatory minimum sentencing law, I don't typically do the representation of juveniles. And it's this whole specialty that deserves its whole focus because, of course, you're dealing with people with growing brains, although we adult criminal defense lawyers know that people's brains are still growing and developing neurologically into their mid-20s or possibly later. And we have to be learning in the frontiers of neuroscience to do what we do, but I don't know it anywhere near enough to be a juvenile lawyer. Those folks are really smart and dedicated.
Okay. Do you have any other questions? Because you already asked a couple of mine here. So
I'm sorry.
I always get in trouble with clerks in court and with the Court of Appeals and with court reporters in federal court when they have a real court reporter. I get in trouble for talking so fast.
You do. You talk exceptionally fast.
You know who talked really quickly? You'd never know it, but go back and count the words. Jimmy Carter talked really fast.
Yeah, people from the South can talk really fast, for sure. I think, I've got a couple of other questions, if you don't mind. Yeah.
That's why I threw it to you.
So one of the things that that people point out as the cause of a lot of problems with the criminal legal system is resources or a lack of resources, and that if agencies just had sufficient resources to undertake their mandates in the way that they're supposed to, that those types of things wouldn't happen. So like you were saying, it's against the rules to assault people in jail. Like, that's not allowed, but it's happening on a regular basis. So is that a resources issue, do you think?
I think it's a resources issue, but it's also a culture and training issue. You know, the sheriff spoke a lot about the importance of training, and you guys talked a lot about law enforcement training standards in that episode. You know, I don't think there's a training/cultural view that these are matters that are uniformly important to identify and enforce the rules around. I think that there's a certain culture in correctional law enforcement, particularly, that, you know, it's okay to let inmates self-police over certain issues. And I think that's toxic and wrong, and unfortunately has to be changed with some mandates from the state level, because these are primarily handled throughout the United States at the state level. But state by state, it should become unacceptable for people to have to do an arbitrary sentence of violence on top of the lawful sentence they're already serving. And that is less a resources issue than it is an issue of completely changing the culture of how prisons are envisioned. Because if we assume that prisons are a violent place, they will be a violent place. They'll stay a violent place because they are. But if we assume that they are inherently violent, we're wrong. The prisons are not inherently violent, and we can look to other countries' examples, and that's an example of what I meant earlier by being more humble as a nation and understanding we don't always have the best model for every human practice.
That's hard for us, though.
It is very hard. I agree. There's a raging debate among the members of the U.S. Supreme Court that was somewhat affected by the death of Justice Scalia, but about whether it was ever proper to cite to international law. The U.S. is so arrogant that we can't even consider the legal opinions of other countries or agencies,
Right.
And yet another one.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. And you said the resources. I mean, other examples of resources. Let me chime in on one other thing. We take seriously this guarantee that public defense funding is guaranteed, but every person in need of a lawyer to be appointed by the court. We have seen other fundamental principles. For example, I would say principles around election laws called into question because state legislative majorities have run somewhat amok. And we look at the Arizona Senate so-called audit. State legislators can also radically alter public defense funding. I would point out that right now there's an emergency with the hurricane in Louisiana. People are being arrested for violating laws allegedly in the wake of the hurricane. The state of Louisiana funds its public defense system off the wages of the people accused of crimes. And if they're not making money because they're in jail after a hurricane and the job isn't there because of the hurricane in the first place, they're not going to get a lawyer, essentially. The states are blessing systems that don't comply with the mandate of Gideon. And the guarantee of public defense is not so strong as people would think. That really matters to the whole justice system around the country. And the Oregon criminal legal system has struggled through dramatic funding woes and ethics woes at its helm in recent months. It's been reported by the Oregonian. And that is quite surprising as well. It's come home.
All right. Any other questions?
Not for me. How about you?
No, like I said,
I took your questions.
Yeah, you took my questions. Any closing thoughts? Any things you want to let our audience know about anything, your practice, anything like that? Any closing words?
Well, if you're interested in learning about what I do, my website is bwnlaw.com. Those are my initials, BWN for Bear Wilner-Nugent law.com. I really miss doing the other things that I do because of pandemic responsibility. I'm not going to the Rogue event on the Black Rock Desert. Burning Man officially has been taking this year off, as well as last year. Normally I would be at Burning Man right now. One of the volunteer jobs I do there is called being a perimeter driver, and I drive a truck around the outside of the city, keeping people safe, doing alternative public safety that's not law enforcement, but making sure people aren't wandering lost in the desert outside of our walls or trying to do anything that they shouldn't be doing on the perimeter of our city, because regular law enforcement won't do that for us. We have to actually do it for ourselves as volunteers.
Nice.
So I miss that, but this is a great honor to be doing this instead, and it's a lot of fun to be able to talk to friendly hosts like yourselves rather than moping that I'm alone during non-Burning Man.
Well, we were definitely glad to have you on to talk about your career and thoughts on the legal profession here. Did you have any comments you wanted to say to Mr. Bear before we wrap up?
Just thank you for being on the show. It's great to have you on the show.
Oh, bashful.
Thanks. Thanks for being okay with me staring off into space answering questions, because I know that doesn't come across in the podcast, but it's how I do my best thinking. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right. So thank you all again for listening. Again, remember, if this is the first time you're listening to the show, remember to subscribe. That really helps us out. Follow us on social media and Discord to keep up with us throughout the week. Links are in the show description. We thank you all for listening. We bid you adieu.
Adieu.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy on iTunes, the Google Play Music Store, as well as Spotify. Remember to support Friends Talking Nerdy on Patreon. Goodbye, darling.